This is the E-Commerce Edge podcast with your host, Jason Greenwood. Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of The Pod with me, Jason Greenwood, your host. It is my pleasure to welcome our next incredible guest, Mr. Bryan Murphy, who's the CEO of Smartling. Welcome to the podcast, Bryan.
Hey, Jason, great to be here.
It's awesome to have you along for the ride with me today. And before we get into what you guys do over at Smartling, how you do it, what makes you guys unique, etc., why don't you tell me, if we run down your history, you've definitely been, I would say that you're, I think the term is serial entrepreneur. I think that's the term that the cool kids use nowadays for people that have started and run and built lots of businesses over the years. But how did you come to be in this language translation space?
Yeah, I've been building businesses in the software or e-commerce world for the last 25 years or so as an entrepreneur and a founder, also working for large enterprise companies like eBay and lots of different software companies. It was kind of an interesting, it's been the fun thing in my career is I've had different type of backing. So I've done venture capital, and more recently I've been working for private equity or growth equity funds. But I ended up here. I've been in the role here at Smartling for just about 3.5 years, almost four. And I got a call from Battery, who's the financial sponsor of the company, that said, "Hey, we're looking at this translation industry and thinking that there's some ways that we can make it faster, better, cheaper kind of thing." And it's a $50 billion global business, which is probably was surprising to me at the time. And the more I looked, the more I liked. In fact, I got so excited. Normally I would advise on a gig like this and maybe get a board seat, but I got so excited about the business, I came in as CEO.
Wow, what a story. And certainly I, as someone who now lives in Mexico and who is not fluent in Spanish, but someone who's conversational in Spanish, I have I guess, a newfound appreciation for translation, and I have a newfound appreciation for all the ways in which translation touches our lives or can touch our lives and the different devices and systems that integrate translation. I'm actually looking at getting a Pixel 10 Pro specifically for its real-time translation capabilities with the Pixel Buds and literal real-time translation when you're speaking with someone. Samsung has come out with on-device translation as well across all apps on the device, which is pretty amazing. And what's super interesting, and we'll get to what you guys do shortly, but I guess just to give a little bit of context on all the ways I've been exposed to translation, it's interesting because almost all of the apps that I use routinely here in Mexico that are localized for Mexico, they have auto translation features built in. So if I'm having a two-way conversation with a ride-hailing service that's not Uber or it's not one of the major global platform vendors, the chat synchronization all happens. You just define what your preferred language is, and the translation all just happens automatically. You don't have to choose to do it. Whereas it's so silly that something like as global as WhatsApp, for example, doesn't have real-time translation. You got to copy and paste the text out of there. You got to paste it into ChatGPT or a language translation service to get a translation. So it blows my mind that English, or let's say English speaking Western world apps, the ones that target the Western world, the Western English speaking world, oftentimes are way behind the times when it comes to translation versus apps that have maybe originated outside the English speaking West. And so, therefore, translation to them is absolutely a core foundational part of the application layer right from day dot. And so this is it's such an important topic to talk about. And it's not just from an e-commerce perspective. It's not just from an app perspective. It's from an everything perspective. And I think what's super interesting about this is, even Google Translate itself, it used to be pretty crap at translation in my experience. And it was because it was a pure word for word translation. It didn't have an understanding of context. It didn't have an understanding of localization in terms of the Spanish that they speak here is very different to what they speak in Argentina or what they speak in Colombia, for example. It had no nuance to translation when you're doing a pure word for word translation. And it feels AI is completely changing the game in that regard. And I noticed that even ChatGPT now, because I've got a paid account with ChatGPT, it knows that I live in Puebla, Mexico, because I've mentioned it in my chats with ChatGPT before. And so when it gives me a translation into Spanish, it gives me a Mexicanized version of the translation because it knows this is where I'm based. So it feels AI is helping us get smarter about this whole translation thing, but it's not as widespread as you would think it would be as of 2025. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think that's right. There's a couple of things going on that are super interesting. One thing, I think the stat is that that less than 20% of the world's internet users speak English, right? So most people, we come from from the US, and so we think about the world as being English speakers, but the reality is less than 20% of the world's internet speaks English. And the other thing that we know is that 40% of people will not buy in other languages, right? So immediately, if you're only speaking English in your content, on your websites, your advertisements, et cetera, you're already limiting your TAM to 20% or less, right? The other thing that's super interesting is that when you actually get into each one of these countries, we know that the other thing we know is that 65% of people, consumers, prefer content in their own language. That makes perfect logic sense, right? The reality of the matter is that 52% of the world's total GDP is within 5 countries. And of that, guess what the average number of languages spoken in each of those 5 countries are?
I don't know, 3?
306.
Wow, that is wild. That I would never ever guess that.
I know, it's right. It's wild, right? So, like, when we think about translation, localization, and globalization, you think about expanding into new markets, which is very true, right? That's one of the big use cases. But even within the US, right? Huge $18 trillion GDP, $20 trillion GDP. There are over 430 languages spoken. And as an e-commerce person, and especially at eBay, right, we're hyper fixated on conversion rate optimization, engagement scores, right? So when you think about the fact that just in the US, there's over 430 languages spoken, right? And 65% prefer content in their own language, that ROI becomes pretty clear. Now, you were asking, okay, why isn't this more widespread? And that's because out of the $50 billion market, or the $50 billion market, is largely predicated on the cost to translate per word. And that is traditionally around 20 cents. It's very expensive. So almost all countries ration their content that they translate. The big unlock over the last 3 years that I've seen, and part of the work that we're doing, I'm sure we'll get more into this, is I have this, if you think about what's your vision, in the same way that AWS and IBM and Microsoft, et cetera, transformed services, right, and created cloud services, right, and Jevons paradox takes hold, right, price comes down, utilization goes up. What we're trying to do at Smartling is essentially do that with translation and turn translation into a service, right? So it's integrated, automated, and automatic, and at a very low cost per word, so that countries can start thinking about unlocking companies can start unlocking their content and driving that ROI, driving that improvement in conversion rate, et cetera, for their customers.
Yeah, and it also feels like the coming of multimodal AI is having a not just AI in general, which we know now, obviously the context window of most of these answer engines is massive. And so therefore we can have much broader conversations with these answer engines than we could with a traditional search engine where maybe you could have a 3-word or 4-word query. And that was, you go beyond that and the results start to become pretty crap pretty fast. Whereas the more context you add, that's the weird thing about AI now and the answer engines, is the more context you give, the better the answers become, or the better the conversation becomes. And I've been using ChatGPT now for, I think, around a year, pretty consistently. In fact, I think it was about 9 months ago, I added a plugin to my Brave browser to where every single web query now gets redirected to ChatGPT. So I haven't run a regular Google search. I can't remember the last time I ran a regular Google search, but I'm still to this day astounded by what ChatGPT can do for me. And I'm still exploring new use cases, it feels like, almost every single day. And I think one of the first times I was truly astounded by ChatGPT was when I snapped a picture of I think it was a recipe, and it was fully in Spanish. And I just grabbed a picture of it with my phone. I took a screenshot of it. I uploaded that to ChatGPT, and I said, "Can you translate this whole thing for me?" I didn't have to copy and paste the text. I literally could just take a snapshot. I could plug it in. Boom, gives me a fully translate. Oh, do you want me to give you the context of this? Do you want me to, and then ask me a bunch more questions? Do you want me to pull down recipes that are similar? Do you want me to pull down all these different, contextual things
Yep.
around the translation? And I feel as though that has allowed us to move into a place where universal translation everywhere, all the time, is within sight. Like it feels like that is no longer a pipe dream. And even to the point where when I signed the contract for this house that we bought in Puebla, it was a PDF, but it wasn't a plain text PDF. It was embedded images of the contract in the PDF. Now, historically, if I wanted to translate that, it had to be plain text. So I could copy, paste it out into a translation service and translate it. But now I can upload a PDF that's all images, and something like ChatGPT or any of these answer engines can translate the whole freaking thing into English for me just from the image. And so it just feels like we are on the cusp of language no longer being the barrier it once was.
Yeah, I think that's very true. And you said some really important things there around context. Context is super important. Scale and volume are another, right? So I'll give you an example. We have customers that are large global enterprises that are translating 50, 100, 300 million words a year. We'll probably translate over 10 billion words this year. And that's at a pace that's growing, probably doubling every year. Okay. So when you do that, it's not just the translation, and you can't like cut and paste and do these sorts of things. It's got to be integrated.
AI first. Yeah.
Yeah, it's got to be integrated and automated, and that's a large part of what we do. So if you think about what we're doing, right? So a lot of companies are trying to figure out how to integrate AI into their businesses, right? I think you may have seen the MIT study that just came out that showed 95% of AI projects within companies fail, right? Which I thought was a really timely piece and makes perfect sense to me. And it's not because enterprises are bad people or that kind of thing. It's just about focus. I'll give you an example of what we tried to do. So I was getting frustrated with our customer experience because I've been one of those CEOs that have said, "Hey, listen, I want AI everywhere in our organization." So each department I've been asking to, "Hey, what's your plan for AI?" I think every CEO in the world is doing that, right? And customer experience was an area that was lagging behind. I said, just integrate that application to GPT and it'll answer questions. That's the way I'm used to. I'm sure it'll be great. And it wasn't. All right. It was a complete failure. We could have added ourselves to the list of 95%. Okay. And that's because we're not experts at doing this very specific kind of work. And so we actually ended up going out with a company called FinAI. It's part of Intercom. Man, we had the thing up and running in 2 weeks, and it's got an 86% customer satisfaction. It's handling the vast majority of our cases. It's like amazing. And so I think about Smartling being in that vein where a lot of our customers are like, "Hey, how do we use AI, GPT, to translate?" Which it can do, right? But it doesn't do it at like the enterprise level, like we just described, right? So what
Totally.
we do is we built a very purpose-built AI application for translation. And it uses AI. And so it plugs right into whatever website management, content management system, CRM system, marketing automation, customer experience, etc. It makes sure that it uses your linguistic assets like translation memory, glossary, style guide, etc. And importantly, does hallucination detection and mitigation. Because I bet you've probably noticed, I'm a big user of GPT, as you might imagine. And man, it hallucinates.
Yep. Yep. They all do. Whether it's Grok, whether it's ChatGPT, whether it's Gemini, they all do.
It just makes stuff up. So one of the early things that we had to do was build this hallucination detection and mitigation application. Once again, if you're doing 10 billion words, it's not enough just to say, "Hey, by the way, this piece of content that's 100,000 words just hallucinated someplace in its 15th language. Go figure it out." No,
Ugh.
right? And that's the whole thing. So you can imagine, use case. I'm a technical documentation writer for a global software company. I just published this whole piece. I press the translate button into 50 different languages. Okay. Literally, that's what happens all the time in our platform. Great. What did it just say in Hmong or Chinese
Yeah.
or simplified Chinese, or you pick it, right?
Or whatever. Yeah.
Exactly. That's one of the powerful aspects of Smartling is really if you just got a simple document that you want to cut and paste, drop it into a window and have it translated so you can grok it.
Yeah.
Great. There's plenty of applications that do that. But if you're a global enterprise that's doing hundreds of thousands, hundreds of millions of words per year and it needs to be on brand accurate and integrated, then you come to Smartling.
Makes complete sense. Tools for the job, I guess, is the key
Yeah,
here. And I guess across every single software category you can think of the specialist and you can think of the generalist. And the generalist platforms are great oftentimes when you're starting out, and they're great when you need to do a lot of things in one application. But once you get to a certain scale level, you need absolutely the right granular tools for the job to allow you to go to the next level in your business. So it makes complete sense. That's a area of specialization of yours. Now let's shift gears a little bit and let's talk a little bit about e-commerce translation specifically. And I've had a little experience with this, having been in the industry for 25 years, and I've seen the evolution of translation in e-commerce. And frankly, it's still pretty shit in general. And it's
yeah.
primarily because most of the e-commerce platforms out there, including even Shopify and the majors, they have not created a translation layer framework within their platforms that allows easy injection of translated content across an entire website. There are certain blocks, there are certain areas, there are certain content types with certain meta tag types and metadata types that are natively open to the API for translation. But there is so much of a website that is not easily translatable, namely images, namely things particularly images that are in as part of the navigation layer, as part of marketing content, things like that. And so I think what I have seen over the years, and whether you're using something like a Weglot or somebody like you or a Langify or any one of the other sort of, if you go to the Shopify App Store today and you type in language translation, you're probably going to find 50 apps that
Yeah.
come up that say that they can translate. And they all have, in my experience, and I've worked with probably, I don't know, 10 different ones over the years, they all have varying degrees of success of translating an entire e-commerce website, but they all have their limitations. And if you want to fully translate a website, in my experience, you pretty much have to go headless, and you have to tap into a third party service like yours, where we're actually tapping into it via API. We're creating a dedicated storefront for that language, and we are translating every single thing on the damn website, all the way down to individual pieces of marketing collateral and everything in between. And so I feel like e-commerce is still in a very difficult position when it comes to translation. And most e-commerce stores and owners that I am aware of, even we're talking even mid-sized e-commerce brands, not the behemoths here, they will translate certain sections of a website, maybe all the visible text on a PDP, for example, and
Yeah.
then they will call it good, because to just get the entire site translated to perfection is so difficult and it is so expensive that they go, that's almost a fool's errand to even try. But do you think that is going to become possible soon?
It's possible today. So you just touched on something that's really important. When people think about translation, right, they think about that, oh, it's about translating whatever this piece of content is. When we think about translation, we think about it in its entirety, right? It's like the 80/20. The kind of, I'm going to say this, like the kind of the easy part is actually doing the translation. What's hard is the connecting of all the plumbing in the background. You just brought up tags and all those kinds of things. And so we spend a lot of time, and we spent years building these connectors to these content management systems and these CRM systems and these marketing automation systems, right? Or exposing APIs. We also just released our very first MCP server, right? Which is a really big deal as we talk about connecting all kinds of different systems within the AI framework. So we really think about, you'll hear me say integrate, automate, transform. And so that's literally where we start. We talk because the vast majority of the value add when you're talking about translating at scale, right, is that integration layer. And it's like not very sexy. It's really complex. It's expensive to do, but we've learned that when we're working with enterprises, that's where the value is. So if you go to Shopify today, you're right. There's 50 different applications that you can use that you can pull from. A lot of them are free or really inexpensive. But if you're really serious about doing that comprehensive translation and localization of your e-commerce site, that's when you come to Smartling. And we do have a very robust Shopify integration, by the way. And we have some of the largest e-tailers in the world use a Smartling to do that comprehensive translation. And actually, what's interesting is we have a lot of fast fashion e-tailers that use this for, as you might imagine, the very reason, right? So they're like constantly turning over their product information, like, and so for them, being able to easily manage that in multiple languages in an integrated and comprehensive way is essential.
And I like to think of it, and I'd love your take on this. I like to contextualize this when I'm talking to my consulting clients, et cetera. And I focus almost exclusively on the B2B world now. So it's a slightly different scenario. But I like to use the term translating an experience, not translating content. And I think to me, that is the better way that brands should start thinking about this is how can we translate and localize the entire experience of our brand in that market or for that person, for that individual. How and it's all part of personalization, right?
Yeah,
That like
yeah,
this to me is effectively just as important to personalize this as it is to personalize product recommendations, to personalize based on preferences and first party data we have about that customer. Like this is so core to e-commerce success that if this is not on your radar, then I think you're missing a trick, a pretty big one.
yeah, it's fascinating. Think about the amount of time, money, and resources spent on personalization. And then here we are with like the ultimate personalization, which is your language. And we talked earlier about the fact that 40% of people won't buy in a language other than their own, 65% prefer to engage in their own language. So that's like when I was at eBay, like that was a massive number. And furthermore, if you told me, hey, Bryan, by doing this thing, we could increase conversion rate by a minimum of 20% up to 70%. I would be like, sign me up. Where, what, how do I do that? And the
Yeah.
answer is localizing content.
And why do you think it is? And I know you don't have a crystal ball on this, so it's really just your seat of the pants feel from the industry itself. Why do you think it is that even the behemoths, and I'm talking the biggest players in the world, like Amazon itself, okay, I shop on Amazon.com.mx all the time, right?
Yeah.
I go to the reviews. I can't localize the reviews in my own friggin' language. If the review has been placed in anything other than Spanish on Amazon.com.mx, I can choose to localize it in Spanish, but Spanish only. Why can I not have a universal setting on my profile that says I want all reviews to be translated into my home language, which is English, right? Why is it that even the largest, most successful companies in the world seem to be missing out on what feels like an absolute no-brainer of an opportunity to light a fire under their growth and light a fire under their conversion rates?
Yeah, I think there's two things. One is, and I'll be honest with you. So I was vice president of vertical markets for eBay. Okay. I had eBay Motors, fashion, daily deals, art and collectibles, yada, global business. I was what was called the global IO, which meant that I owned product and strategy globally for these
Wow.
verticals, right? Um, even then, and that was a while ago, I didn't think that much about translation and localization. I'll be completely honest with you. And I don't think it's top of mind for a lot of executives. I've 25 years I've been building e-commerce and software businesses. I've translated and localized all those applications, websites, etc., for that period of time. But I did it as infrequently as possible because it's always a pain and it's been expensive. And it was like it wasn't top of mind. It really wasn't until I got into this business that I began to understand the impact of translation localization on the conversation that we're having right now. And I think that there's a lack of awareness amongst e-commerce executives about how powerful this tool can be. Number one. Number two is our traditional understanding of translation localization was the one that I had before I got to Smartling. I didn't know the companies like Smartling existed. My kind of like experience with translation was okay, I extract all the content from the website, I put it in a spreadsheet, I email it to the LSP, they translate it 2 weeks later, I get it back, and then I do this whole process again. Errors, pain. It was expensive and painful. I didn't realize that there was a solution like Smartling where you can automate 99% of that process and do it for a fraction of hundredths of a penny, right? From a cost perspective with very high on brand accuracy. And that unlock has really manifested itself in the last, especially with the advent of large language models, in the last 2 years. So I don't think, Jason, that there's a lot of awareness amongst e-commerce executives and B2B marketing executives that this capability exists. So it's actually, in my mind, for our customers, the ones that are leveraging this at scale globally, are actually they actually have a secret weapon that they're deploying to drive global growth.
And how much of this is down to something as we can overcomplicate this, but if I try to take the Occam's razor ideal around this and say the simplest answer is usually the right one here, how much of this do you think simply comes down to the fact that probably of the top 100 CEOs of the top 100 companies on this planet, I'm guessing, and I don't know the exact number, but I would guess that greater than 80 or 90% of them, their first language is English. And so, how much of this is down to the fact that this is simply not a pain point for the decision makers in our industry? And it doesn't have to be an arrogance thing. It just has to be, it's simply not a pain point for them. So it's natural that if it's not a pain point for them, it's not going to be on their radar.
I think that's actually a really great explanation. I think you're exactly right. I once again, before I got into this world, I didn't really understand. I was responsible for global businesses. I lived in Japan. So I think intuitively I knew these things, but when you're kind of like in the heat of running a business, it's not the first thing that comes to mind, to be honest with you. And I told you some stats earlier. Like, I think that when I asked you what's the average number of languages spoken in the U.S., I think you said three. I think that most people would think that, but the reality is it's over 400, and that less than 20% of internet users are English speakers. That's wild when you think about it.
And I think also translation of audio. So I translate my podcast into Spanish only right now. And I use HeyGen because it's got the voice. It doesn't just have to do the translation, it's got the voice, the face, and the lip sync. So it literally looks like I'm speaking that language. And so my guests are. But what's interesting is that this translation question, this translation issue, it extends into many more areas than just plain text application. It touches audio, video, text, images, like buttons, navigational structures, even the order of words. In Spanish, they don't use AI, they use IA. And so there's so many subtle nuances to this that impact somebody's engagement. It's not even an engagement model, it's the entire feeling that they get when they engage with you. It comes down to empathy. If I was to boil it down to its most simple, fundamental thing, it feels if you have empathy for the people that you're working with, if you have empathy for your customers, if you have empathy for your prospects, if you have empathy for people outside your immediate sphere, then it feels like this should be somewhere near the top of your priority list because it is so impactful in the way that someone feels about you individually and feels about you as a brand. And which is why because I know that even though I live in Mexico now, I don't consult to Mexican companies because I cannot do that fluently in
Yeah.
Spanish. So I don't target this market simply because I have too much respect for the people here to say, look, that's your problem to worry about. Figure it out. Get someone English speaking on your team that I can engage with. No, I just don't even try to sell into this market because I have too much respect to do. And so I think that it comes down to, do companies have empathy or don't they? And how can they better exercise the empathy muscle in their business?
Yeah, I tell you what, that's a really amazing insight, and I think you're exactly right. And when I think about brand, right? So translation localization departments typically will sit within the marketing department. And most of the larger global companies do understand that it is a big part of brand because it is that, how am I communicating with my customer? Am I on the same level? And I'll give you a couple of good examples. A lot of companies will use like a plain machine translation or large language models because it's really inexpensive to translate certain types of content, like user generated content. And when you read that content, you can tell, okay, I see that, I can tell that this has been done by a machine. And you're like, okay, they gave it a try. At least they're trying here, but it's like you don't connect with it necessarily. What we help our customers do is to actually create custom trained models so the translations sound like their brand, is on brand, has the correct vernacular, glossary. I'll give you an example. Localization, right? Tone, style guide, right? Germans speak differently than Japanese and different than Americans. There's different tones in French, right? So if even if you translate it perfectly, but you say it in the wrong tone, it's gonna be flat, right? So that's a lot of the work. In fact, one of the things from a quality measurement that we do, we know that this is going to sound wonky, but like we know that the quality of our AI translation is 63% better than what you get out of the box out of GPT. And because it does have that translation memory, it does have that glossary, style, tone of voice, etc. It sounds the brand wherever you are in the world. And even different companies, right? They have different brands. Like IBM and Apple, two tech companies couldn't have different
Yeah. Their
tones.
view of the world is different.
Exactly. So you got to match those things. And I think when you connect, and that's why you notice some commercials are so great, because when they connect with you, when a brand connects with you at the human level, it has an impact. And that's the difference between a great brand and like a no-name brand. And so it stands to reason that then if you're trying to communicate and connect with your customers globally, then translation is a huge part of that.
Yeah, and I mean, it even as someone who grew up in the United States, moved to New Zealand, now lives in Mexico, travels to the US a ton for business still now, even the subtleties of British English, New Zealand English, Australian English, American English, and even the senses of humor, the way in which things get described, like they might as well be different languages in some respects. Like when I first moved to New Zealand, the tone that I had to learn how to speak as a Kiwi would speak, and I had to dial it back 10 notches from how I would communicate in the US. And the sense of humor is a much drier sense of humor. It's not an overt, in your face type of sense of humor. The way that people converse in the boardroom in New Zealand or in Australia is very different to boardroom conversations I'm having in the United States. And you have to adapt. Like you almost have to, before you walk in the door, you got to go, okay, cool. I know where I'm going. I know the environment. I have to be respectful of that environment. And I have to make sure that I'm adapting to try to get the best result for everybody in the room and be contextually aware of where that conversation is happening. And I feel like that is as much a part of translation as anything else. Culture.
Yeah, that's a great point. So if you've got international business experience, you know what to do when you walk into a boardroom in London or in Tokyo or Berlin.
Yep.
They're different, right,
Yes.
than the US. And so you set your style and tone accordingly, not even including the language, right?
Yeah.
And even adjust with the language. That's the same thing that happens with translation and localization in the multimedia world, right? So I'm reading something. I should understand contextually how I should be communicating. I'm watching a video or listening to a podcast, etc. All of those things have context, and human beings, are wildly perceptive at these things. Like I'm sure you notice this, like you can read something and you can instantly spot whether or not that was done by a machine or by a person, I think. Uh,
Totally.
Often, right? Or even, hey, I always like to say, I'm reading something. I'm like, did GPT write that or did a person, right?
Yep.
And what we try and do with our translation and localization is, and this is where we actually have, it's not all just machine translation, large AI translation. One of the things that we've really done is we've developed this, what we call AI human translation, which is basically like a human augmented AI translation, human in the loop. And that's super important because what we can do is we can get like 95% of it done, right, with AI. We can run the hallucination detection and mitigation, the post editing, cleanup, all this stuff, and get it as close to perfect as we can get. And then we run a quality assessment against it. And then we show that in a report, and we show that in a contextual screen to a professional human translator. And they will look through the whole thing and they'll go, oh yeah, that's wrong. That's wrong. I'm going to fix this, that. And they're tweaking it and cleaning up. That translation is then perfect. Okay. As perfect as a human translator, professional human translator can make it. And they're able to do it for a fraction of the time and cost of what is a traditional translation. Just to close it off for a second, so like once again, we're getting back to this $50 billion global translation business, right? Cajillions of words. 95% of that, 45 billion of that is still done the old way. This industry is going through a massive shift where now it's moving to this new model where it's either what we'll call it trained or custom model AI translation, standalone for low content that has lower needs, to if it's got to be perfect content, we pair that with a human translator and are able to do that for literally a fraction of the cost and a fraction of the turnaround time of that traditional translation. And that's a massive unlock for e-tailers and B2B software sellers.
And if we were to look at the breakdown of your cohorts of customers, like what percentage, it doesn't, you don't have to be exact. I know this is commercially sensitive, but like what percentage would be like e-commerce businesses versus, I don't know, like translation of books into internationalization versus translation of mobile app content or SaaS app content versus, I don't know, some marketing material or something like that. Who are and what types of content are the biggest buckets of areas that you typically play in and that you see demand from?
I would say that the biggest, from an industry perspective, it's mostly technology, so B2B and B2B company, B2C companies, e-tailers, state and local government is a big one.
Wow. Wow. Yeah.
Uh, Fintech, pharma are other big ones. Those are
Oh,
regulated industries, and they have mandates to communicate in multilingual way. So those are typically the big ones. And then from a content perspective, it's mostly, once again, they fall into three buckets. It is mostly what I'll call marketing related content. So that's websites, blogs, marketing communications, etc. Right. And then it's product, right? I've got a software application that I've localized to be in French, German, Japanese, right? So I'm logging in from Japan. My software application is in Japanese. It's written correctly, all that kind of thing. And then I would say the latter third is probably in like the learning and development space or customer service. So I'm in Poland and I'm a customer service rep and I'm talking to someone in Mexico. I don't speak Spanish. That's okay. The software it does that translation for us.
yeah. Real time translation effectively.
Yeah, correct. Correct.
Wow, absolutely incredible. And how much do you play in like the book publishing space, or are there other areas or legal, for example, the legal industry, which is just massive, and we're talking another super highly regulated industry being legal. How much of those two worlds do you play in the publishing industry, for lack of a better term?
Yeah, that's a great question. The publishing industry is a very specific sort of niche, and there's a number of really great translation localization companies that specialize in that niche. That's not one that we get involved with. Interestingly enough, it's just like a different animal. Legal is kind of like that too. It's got a very specific sort of like skill set required there. And once again, wrong or indifferent, that's just not an area that we get involved with that much. They're very
I think niching down is a superpower, and I think knowing what you're great at versus what you're not great at is equally, those two things are equally important if you're going to make a splash. And certainly, as I've niched down harder and harder, feels it's at the start, like when you're young and when you're maybe perhaps a new entrepreneur, you want to go for everything. You don't want to say no to any opportunity. But I think the more mature you become as an entrepreneur, the more experienced you become as an entrepreneur, you start to really recognize that niching down is a superpower and that it actually opens up more opportunity within that niche for you to dominate, because it's impossible to dominate everything all everywhere all at once. It's just impossible. No matter how much resources you think you have, it's impossible. And so I think being able to dominate in a very select niche and then maybe perhaps over time edging into adjacencies where it makes sense to is a great, like the whole land and expand model, I
yeah.
think is a very well-known trodden thing. For you guys, it feels like you found your blue ocean space where there's not anyone doing things exactly the way you're doing them in exactly the verticals you're doing them in. And that's always a preferred place to be than jumping into a red ocean where you got 100 competitors. Like that doesn't make any sense whatsoever. So that makes complete sense. What is next for you guys in terms of development, capabilities, pricing, because from what I see, token costs are falling through the floor very rapidly. The build out of AI infrastructure is still happening to the tune of billions of dollars a quarter, although that's slowing a little bit from the latest quarter, what we can see with investments of Google and the majors. And so what do you see as like top of your radar when you look out over the next 6, 12, 18 months? What are some things you either don't do today that you think you should be doing, or things that you don't do today that your customers are saying, we'd love it if you did this?
Yeah. So I still think about so the problem that we're trying to solve is that we know that most companies ration content, right?
Yes.
Because of the difficulty of translating it and the cost mostly. We're very focused on building out a translation as a service model, right? So that basically think about AWS, right? So it's got literally every service. I push a button, I flick a switch, and I've got the service that I need. It scales up or down globally. It's a service, right?
It's like magic.
Like magic, right? We're well down the path of having translation operate that way so that our customers can seamlessly translate any amount of content that they wish to translate. So that's part of it, right? That's the actual service of it. Then there's the economics of it, right? We're rapidly working on evolving and improving the quality of our AI translation to the point where you don't need to have as many. As that translation volume goes up, I can do it without having to add exponentially more translators to the mix, and the cost comes down appropriately. And so that's really part of the scale. And I think that companies that are able to take advantage of that and unlock their content are going to be able to unlock huge segments of the global TAM, like we just talked about. And I think that's a huge opportunity for our customers.
I love it. I love it. And how do you guys make your money? Is it on a per letter basis? Is it on a per word basis? Like, how do you typically engage with your customers in terms of quantum? Is it tiering? Is it between this range and this range you get charged this much a month? How do you typically, is it per API call? Is it like, how do you charge for your services?
Yeah, essentially it boils down to volume, and the driver here is words. So you can think about it simply as that, and there's different price points depending on the modality of translation. But at the end of the day, it really boils down to words. And it's actually really interesting. I just did an analysis the other day where I was like, AI, are we making translation more efficient for our customers? And what I did is I actually took all of the costs that we charge our customers and I divided it by the number of words that they're able to translate. And it's really interesting. Over the last 60 months or so, or I should say, I'm sorry, the last 36 months or so, we've been able to bring down our customers' cost per word translation by 60%. And I think we're just at the very beginnings of that. And so what's really interesting is that they're not cutting their budgets, right? These departments, they don't like to cut their budgets, but they're able to translate significantly more content for the same dollars. And that's super attractive to them. And I think that as AI translation becomes more acceptable within these global enterprises, that number is going to go parabolic. And it's really fascinating. I drew two charts. I drew a chart of cloud services, right? So cost, volume, and I overlaid our cost word volume, and they mirrored each other. It was so fascinating. So that's
They
just
call it
paradigm.
the X curve. That there's a
Yeah.
term for that. They call it the X curve. And when you can find the point in the X curve where now all of a sudden your cost drops to the point where adoption becomes parabolic, that's kind of like the holy grail, right?
Yeah. I'm glad because they were both X's. So
Yeah.
yes, that's exactly what's happening.
Wow, incredible. And how much of your originating content starts in English? Is it like
Oh,
90% of the content starts in English and then it ends up in other languages? Or like what is the top five, say, originating languages of the content that you tend to translate?
that's a great question. It is mostly English. Even around the world, it's English, especially with technology companies. They tend to write a lot of content in English. And then it's FIGS. So that's the
French?
French, Italian, German,
Yeah.
Spanish
Yep.
is the FIGS. And that represents a huge swath of content that gets created.
I love it. I love it. Listen, this has been an absolutely fascinating conversation. Look, I've never gone this deep on the podcast before about language, so I really appreciate your knowledge, your expertise, your willingness to share it. If people want to get a hold of you, I'll drop a link to obviously your website as well as your individual LinkedIn profile. But other than that, if people want to get a hold of you and talk all things language translation, experience translation, what's the best way to get a hold of you?
You can come to smartling.com, obviously, and get in touch with us there, or you can get a hold of me on LinkedIn is probably the best way.
I love it. I love it. Now, as we do come down to the end of our time together, this is the point where I get to flip the script. I get to turn the microphone over to you. I get to let you ask me one question, any question that you like. It can be personal or professional. So, Mr. Bryan Murphy from Smartling, what is your question for me today?
I'm dying to know what got you from New Zealand to Mexico.
Look, lots of reasons. Look, I've always loved Mexico. I've been coming to Mexico since I was a teen, living in Southern California. Went across the border on quite a number of occasions, and I've always loved the Mexican culture. I've always loved Mexican food. Growing up in Southern California, obviously, have always loved the weather. Have always loved the people. Have always loved the celebratory nature of the culture here. But the final straw, if I had to point to one thing that was the final straw to get us to actually make that large of a move with my wife, who's a Kiwi, and moving outside of New Zealand for the very first time for her. Obviously, this is a second country move for me, but it's a first for her. It was how New Zealand handled COVID. That was the final straw.
Hmm.
It was one of the most locked down countries in the entire world after Australia. It was basically, we were in a prison for 3 years. It was horrific from a totalitarian regime perspective. That's the only way I can contextualize it, because it was pretty horrific, especially if you didn't vaccinate, like my wife and I don't. We're into natural health, and we don't vaccinate. And so for those of us that chose not to vaccinate, we had an even lower level of freedom than everybody else in society. And there was definitely a two-tier society created in New Zealand. And it was bad. It was really bad. And the number of vaccine mandates across a number of industries, the number of mask mandates across a number of industries, it was bad. And so for us, we were like, man, as soon as the world opens back up again and as soon as we can get out of here, we are out of here. And so Mexico was right at the top of my list. And my wife and I looked at it, and Mexico has the other benefit of Mexico specifically. There's two: the proximity to the U.S., because I have a lot of clients in the U.S. and I go to a lot of conferences in the U.S. So easy access to the United States was very attractive. And then the second part of that was the Mexico has one of the most immigration friendly immigration policies in the world.
Hmm.
And so they don't do like a point system. They don't do, it's not the US or the UK or New Zealand, Australia, or Canada. It's not based on a point system based on age, education, income. It's basically, there's a financial threshold. They don't want you to be a financial burden on the government or society. And as long as you qualify financially to be self sufficient, and they reset that threshold every single year in January, as long as you can meet that threshold and show proof that you can meet that threshold over the prior 12 months, then you can come in. And those are some of the motivations for us to be here. But it's been a fantastic move for us. We've actually bought a house here now. We've adopted a local Mexican street dog. We just love living here. The one downside that's probably been the single biggest challenge, my wife being Asian, is not a lot of excellent Asian food here. It's just not a big thing here yet, because of the amount of, and coming from New Zealand and the Australian region, where there's a huge Asian population, and so a massive variety of Asian cuisine there. That's probably been the hardest part about the move. And I know it sounds strange to say that food is a difficult part of a migration. When it's a big part of your culture, it can be tough.
For sure. I love the global nature of your story. It's just incredible. Our industry is so much like that. Every time I meet someone in the industry, I feel like such a troglodyte because I speak English, really bad Spanish, and even worse French, and even worse Japanese. And I try really hard, but there's so many people that are polyglots and they've lived in so many different parts of the world. It's just so amazing. And you realize how many amazing people there are all around the world. So I think your story and your global story is super interesting.
Thank you so much. I feel lucky, privileged, and blessed to be able to do what I do, and to be able to do it globally, and to be able to travel globally, and be able to see the world through other people's eyes, like in their home country. That to me is, if you want to exercise your empathy gene, I just think that's my advice to my audience, as often as I can get it out there, is if you want to grow your empathy gene and you want to exercise your empathy muscle, you got to travel. You have to see the world through other people's eyes. You have to try to live in another country for 6 months, live in another country for 6 months, or live there for a couple of years. I just think that people miss out on the opportunities that the world has to offer, because they don't go, and they don't walk, that saying, walk a mile in someone's shoes. Yeah, that's a real thing. Like, that has a real impact on you, and it affects your psyche when you can literally just sit there and observe the world through their eyes and see why their perceptions are the way that they are, and why their thinking is the way that it is, and why their legal system is the way that it is, and all the other things that go around that. It's just so hard to do that when you live in your bubble. I have a tremendous amount of friends that I grew up with when I was young that have never left their hometown. Like, they were born, they've grown up, They live and they will die in the town that they were born in. And that to me, that's great for them. But for me, I cannot think of anything worse personally for me.
We have a mission here at Smartling. It's one of the things I think that people who work here really appreciate is we always talk about bringing the world together through words. And you think about we have employees in 20 different countries. We translate across 450 language pairs. It's just a really great, probably customers and translators in over 200 countries. And just bringing the world together through words, creating that empathy, like I agree with you on, is a really wonderful byproduct of our business.
I couldn't agree with you more. Thank you so much for your time. I seriously appreciate it. I wish you every success with the business, and I can't wait to speak to you again soon. Thank you. Are you a B2B or D2C e-commerce merchant? Then head over to greenwoodconsulting.net to learn how we can help you scale your business.